You are listening to Talking Images. I'm Chris, and today's episode will cover one of the great existential questions of our time. What is your all-time favorite film? And why? And luckily, I'm not alone. To take on these heavy questions, I'm joined once again by Gary, Tom, and Saul. I have to be honest here. Going into this podcast, I thought I would be talking about Stalker by Andrei Tarkovsky, which has been my go-to favorite film for years. But that won't be the film I will be presenting today. It unfortunately decreased in value on rewatch, and instead I will be presenting Last Year at Marienbad. Hopefully, my co-host won't be as confused. So guys, let's just bring our listener up to speed, introduce yourselves, and tell us what your favorite film is.
Hi, I'm Gary from the People's Republic of Virginia in the United States. My favorite film is Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai, and I'm happy and excited to talk about this movie today.
Hi, it's Tom here from England. My favourite film is Stanley Kubrick's hugely controversial dystopian sci-fi film, A Clockwork Orange.
Hi, I'm Saul from Australia. The films that I'm going to be talking about today are Videodrome from David Cronenberg and Ingmar Bergman's Fanny and Alexander, because I'm in a bit of a bind at the moment where I'm not actually sure which one is my favorite film.
Thank you, everyone. And if you out there, yes, you listener, thought we had to drag our feet through some concocted build-up, you're wrong. You're diving right into it. While my favorite film may not have the most straightforward narrative in cinema history, this podcast sure does. So what we'll do is make it as simple as possible. We'll go around in a circle, starting with Tom, then Gary, then Saul, and finally myself. And we'll simply just tell you why we love our favorite film. And then we'll just open up the floor for some questions and comments. And we'll start with Gary.
I'm very excited to talk about Seven Samurai. I thought I might be preaching to the converted among film buffs, but I found that many of my compatriots have avoided it because it is a very long film. It's 207 minutes. I've seen it many times, and it feels to me more like 107 minutes. I watched it again this week just to refresh and collect my thoughts, and it was just as thrilling to me as the first time. I just found myself smiling as I watched it. Let me start with the basic plot. A small farming village is bedeviled by bandits. They come every year after the harvest. They steal the villagers' food and their women. So the villagers have decided they've had enough. They decide to hire some samurai to guard them, but they have no money. So their wise old sage suggests that they go find hungry samurai. So they first secure the services of Kambai, who is played by Takashi Shimura. He's one of Kurosawa's favorites, and he was the lead in another great Kurosawa film, Ikiru. He embodies the samurai code of selflessness, and he's really a towering figure as the leader. He, through his force of will, basically recruits another 5 samurai. And the first hour or so of the film is really a leisurely pace, gives us time to meet and know the different samurai and several of the farmers. The 7th samurai is Toshiro Mifune, and he is basically the center of the film. He tags along with the group and eventually joins them. And he's an irrepressible scamp, he's comic relief, and he's an important bridge between the samurai and the farmers. Thematically, his presence explores and explains the relationship between the samurai and the farmer class. So why is this film my favorite? Well, it's really just a combination of technical brilliance, cinematography, it's a thrilling adventure, great score, and the editing. To me, it's basically a perfect film. Kurosawa is known as one of the greatest film editors, and to me, that's what makes this film so watchable despite the length. He uses a lot of wipes to impart energy. There are many long scenes in the first part, but after the intermission, the cuts get shorter and shorter. The final battle in this movie in a driving rain and mud is just stunning, with many shots only lasting a second or two. A couple small things that really appealed to my sensibility. They use a couple devices. There's a map that they use to set their defenses. They have a moat. They put up barriers, and they show the map, and then they show the places actually where they're doing these things. I like that. And another thing was that they had a chart where they marked off bandit numbers as they are killed. It started off with insurmountable odds, basically. 7 samurai against 40 or so bandits. And I just like the device of seeing them X off the ones as they start to even up the odds. And I'm going to end with a quote that I found from the film critic Kenneth Turan. He says that Kurosawa proceeds like a master chef, allowing his ingredients to simmer and become tastier, tastier, and tastier still.
A little bit embarrassed to say that I haven't seen Seven Samurai in maybe 14 or so years. And I think it speaks to its power as a tremendous part of cinema history, just a tremendous work, is that I still remember so much about it. There's so many of the scenes that are etched into my mind, like the subservient and simply obsessed way that Mifune's character rolls out his sheet of ancestry, trying to prove that he is indeed a samurai and can join them. There are just so many images from the film, so many actions by the characters in the film just burnt into my mind, and I think that truly shows how brilliantly the film was made.
I'm among those film goers who haven't checked out Seven Samurai yet, which is one of those things where it's, well, maybe my film buff license should be revoked. It is because of the length, which is not really a great excuse. I always find that with really long films, especially if they're in a foreign language, it's really hard to actually sit down and watch them unless you know it's something that you could really be interested in. And samurai films is not really an area that I've really got into much in film. I do like other stuff that I've seen from Kurosawa. I do like I Live in Fear from 1955. That's a really good film. I liked his Dreams. I actually like Yojimbo, which is a samurai film, so I guess it's a bit of a contradiction in there. Yeah, I know it's one of those films that I should see, one of those films that I do have to see at some point in my life, but it's just never come to it yet. Maybe it will this year.
So just do it. I mean, honestly, when Gary started talking about Seven Samurai, and I realized how long it's been since I saw it, I just really want to watch it again, and know I will soon. So maybe we can even set up a separate podcast for it, just to give you that extra excuse. But unlike so many other, classic 3-4 hour movies, I mean, this film really feels so incredibly short. It is an action adventure in just its finest sense.
I am also a huge fan of Seven Samurai. I think Gary and Chris put it nicely when they say that it's a long film, but it goes by at such a pace. Even though the action doesn't really get going for perhaps the first hour or so, you just become so invested in these characters, and it's a great story of the underdog, a few against many, rallying together for a righteous cause. And it is one of the pinnacles of the samurai genre, which is perhaps why it is a story that has been adapted so many times throughout the history of cinema by other cultures, putting their own spin on the classic Japanese tale of the Seven Samurai.
That's actually a really interesting point, Tom, that you mentioned of being really classic tale that's been done a lot, because it's like the Magnificent Seven. I've never seen that, even though it's a classic 60s film, because I've always like, well, I should see the Seven Samurai first, but then that's 3 hours long, so I've never seen the Magnificent Seven either, which is again another big hole in my movie viewing career.
Magnificent Seven really does not hold a candle to Seven Samurai, though.
One thing that I think is worth mentioning is also A Bug's Life is heavily influenced by Seven Samurai. It follows the same template to this storyline, but obviously adapted for a children's audience.
I had no idea about that. I always thought A Bug's Life was a copy of the movie Ants, of which I've actually seen neither of them, so it's really interesting to learn. You learn something new every day.
Is this the point when you realize that the Lion King is actually Hamlet? Which also brings things a bit full circle, because Kurosawa, of course, did do Shakespeare adaptations in a samurai setting.
In the films like Throne of Blood, because I actually haven't seen those either. I've actually only seen 8 Kurosawa films, which is, I know, again, quite shameful. But yes, it's not something I haven't really explored much, Japanese samurai films. Oh, and I haven't seen Ran either, which is also meant to be one of Kurosawa's top 5 films.
Come on! Yeah, Ran is fantastic as well. It's a genuine masterpiece.
You want to know the most shameful thing? I actually own all these Kurosawa films because I'm a big film collector. I've actually got upwards of 9,000 films on DVD, Blu-ray, VHS, etc. So I do have Ran on Blu-ray. I've got Seven Samurai on Blu-ray. I've got Akiro somewhere. So all the big films that I haven't seen I actually own. But that's the same for all the directors, which I've just never gotten around to. But I just still love collecting films. So I've got access to them if I want them. I'm sure I will eventually somewhere along my journey.
Well, there's no escaping it then. Seven Samurai podcast, here we come. So let's bring the conversation on to the next co-host and next favorite film. Take it away, Tom.
So my favourite film is the hugely controversial dystopian sci-fi by Stanley Kubrick, A Clockwork Orange. And this is a story about a violent gang leader with a passion for classical music, and it's based on the novel by Anthony Burgess. I'm a big fan of the tagline, which kind of sums up what the film is about, which is being the adventures of a young man whose principal interests are rape, ultraviolence, and Beethoven. That, for me, in a nutshell, tells the potential audience if it's a film that they are going to be interested in. And for me, it is certainly one that I would be interested in. So Malcolm McDowell stars in this film as Alex DeLarge, and he's a nasty, repulsive character. Yet through his twisted humour that we're exposed to throughout the narration and the horrific experimental brainwashing that he endures when the authorities capture him, Kubrick comes close to making us feel sorry for Alex by the end, which I think is quite an impressive feat. Now, A Clockwork Orange was banned shortly after its release in Britain. The reason being, Stanley Kubrick became aware of acts of copycat violence that were taking place. And he was fearful of this association between the real-life crimes and a film that he had laboured so long upon. So he actually pulled the film from distribution. And it remained banned in this country until 2000, which was a year after the director's death. And it was then re-released. And at this point, I was a young teenager, and I stumbled upon the film when staying around at a friend's house for a sleepover. At the time, we weren't aware that what we were watching was unsuitable for our eyes, but it had a huge impact on my viewing habits. And this is something that I mentioned briefly in our first episode, how we got into film. The fact that this film had been banned, I suppose it was Kubrick who pulled it himself, but the fact that it had been deemed unsuitable for my eyes by someone else made me all the more interested to watch it and find out more about it. And this kind of sparked my viewing habits, wherein I wanted to see films that had been banned or had controversial issues surrounding them. Now, part of why I love this film is how beautifully it's shot. Stanley Kubrick started out his career as a photographer, and this builds into all of his films as he improves throughout his career. He's got a real keen eye for cinematography, and he also uses very playful music schemes in some of his films, particularly in Clockwork Orange. The use of classical music with such graphic violence makes for a number of frighteningly memorable scenes. Kubrick also boldly uses the title song from Singing in the Rain in one of the most graphic and traumatic scenes in A Clockwork Orange, perhaps tarnishing one of Hollywood's most uplifting musicals in the process, because once you've witnessed this debauchery, you'll perhaps never hear the song in the same way again. Now, at the time, A Clockwork Orange received 4 Oscar nominations for Best Picture, Director, Writing, and Editing at the 1972 awards. Kubrick came away empty-handed, and he never received a Best Director Academy Awards, losing out to the French Connection at the 1972 awards. But anyway, that explains part of why I love A Clockwork Orange so much. And I know that a few of my co-hosts enjoy the film, perhaps not as much as I do, but they have an appreciation for it. So I'll be happy to hear about what they want to say about the film.
Clockwork Orange was my favorite film as well for many, many, many years. I think I've seen it more than any other film as an adult. It's phenomenal in every way, especially the visual style, which is simply iconic. It's simultaneously beautiful, but it's distressing, it's surreal, it's grotesque. Like there's that opening scene with the mannequins and the stein used in every single scene. It's incredible. It's just so well put together. And one point you didn't bring up, and I'm not sure we want to spoil the film as well, but there's just so much going on here, including the film's circular logic, which, yeah, we probably shouldn't spoil that.
Well, I also love A Clockwork Orange. In fact, that was my previous favorite film. I could almost put Seven Samurai 1A and Clockwork Orange 1B. But something that really appeals to me is, the overarching theme is that you really can't change human nature. And in the hospital, the prime minister comes to visit him, and basically they're just going to push it under the rug. Sort of reminds me of something going on in a certain country where I live with the coronavirus and the way that our politicians are handling that.
Even though I haven't seen The Seven Samurai yet, and you're all going to keep going on about that, I've seen Clockwork Orange maybe 5 or 6 times over the years. It's a film that, like Tom, I got into at a very early age. Even not as early as Tom, I would have been maybe 15, 16, 17 when I sat down to watch it. I just remember watching, and I remember really feeling the thrill of the characters. Driving around at night, getting up to mischief, really felt invested in what Alex was doing, which is a bit odd because what he's doing with all the ultra violence is really wrong. But I really felt for the whole scenes of driving out in the night together. And now I'm much older than Alex's character is in the film. So it's interesting to watch from that perspective. But I just find it always a really overwhelming assault on the senses, which is really what makes a lot of my favorite films. There's really great music in there that's already been mentioned, especially in the opening credits with those flashes of different colors for the different title cards. I really like watching that opening part with the lights off and the colors just overwhelm your face and really get you set up for this world that you're about to be put into. It's a semi-futuristic setting. And actually what I love so much about that is the first time I watched A Clockwork Orange, I didn't realize it was set in the future. Just because everything is so gradual, different changes, it's not a lot different to what life is now, which I think is a more realistic look at the future. It's not going to be like things whizzing around your head all the time. It's going to be the small, subtle changes. And of course, the smallest of the subtle changes is the integration of Russian language into the film, which is something which Burgess had in his original novel, because he saw the future as being at the point where the Soviet Union and the United States would combine, because that's how he saw the Cold Wars going off. So, yeah, no, it's a very interesting film, and I've always got quite a lot out of it. It has gone up and down in my esteem a bit over time. There was a point, maybe about 15 years ago, where I would have said it was my favorite film. I actually would have said that for about 3 or 4 years. But yeah, it's always had a big impact to me. And going back to what's been said before by my co-host, the fact that he's such a horrible person, and yet we become so invested in him, and we do actually feel sympathy for him because of everything that he goes through. And it's got one of those endings where you're sort of looking at it, go, well, is it a happy ending? Is it a not happy ending? I'm not sure. It's definitely one of those films that leaves you thinking.
It's also just fantastically hilarious. I mean, this is just a bizarre, absurd film. There's nothing here that can really truly be related to our own world. Everything is blown up. Everything is disturbed in one way or another. It's just this kind of hyper absurdity. It's one of those things that makes it one of the most special, unique, and wonderful films in cinema history, in my mind.
I might just also mention, because Tom brought it up, about the film's Academy Award nominations. It does seem a bit ridiculous looking back all these years on that it lost out to a film like The French Connection. But I guess we have to put ourselves back in the shoes, and this is going back almost 50 years ago now. I guess The French Connection was a really big film at the time because all those chase scenes, getting on and off the train, were very new, whereas these days it's very by the book. Whereas A Clockwork Orange is actually a film that has stood the test of time, and it's a film that these days probably would have won Best Picture in a different environment. Oscar's always interesting to look at, but I guess from my point of view, I also look at it that it's actually lucky enough that the film was popular enough to get that Best Picture nomination, to get that Best Director nomination. I mean, 2001: A Space Odyssey wasn't nominated for Best Picture, only got a nomination for Best Director. And Paths of Glory, that didn't get nominated. Spartacus won 4 Oscars, but didn't get a Best Picture Oscar nomination. Kubrick in general is just one of those directors where how he is perceived these days is much different to how the whole Oscar thing has treated him. But at least did win a competitive Oscar for the special effects for 2001: A Space Odyssey. I think that's nice.
Honestly, though, I would say that if anything, A Clockwork Orange gets better with age because it just moves further and further away from any resemblance to our reality. Like the 70s aesthetics on a futuristic story, it just turns into this alternative, timeless reality that will just continue to be a stranger, but also more gripping image and expression. It's just going to keep growing and keep becoming more and more absorbing as time goes on.
I completely agree there with Chris about A Clockwork Orange and improving with age. It's rare for me to rewatch a film so much, and that perhaps stems from the fact that I like to watch films for escapism. I love to be captivated by a story and just forget about the world and just immersed into this film that someone has created. And as Sol mentioned earlier, A Clockwork Orange, it's just so overwhelming, it's provocative, and it grabs you straight away. It's so easy to become immersed in this incredible world. And that, I think, is why I keep returning to it time and time again, because I know that each time I put it on, I'm in for one hell of a ride.
All right, that's a fantastic conclusion, I think. Let's move on to Saul and his personal dilemma between two great films.
When we decided to have this topic about favorite films, I thought this would be really interesting because this is something that I have never been solid on. My favorite films have always changed a lot over the years. When I first really got into film and registered with IMDb in 2001, my favorite films, I think, were probably The Matrix and American Beauty, which were very recent films. Looking at films these days, my favorite film has changed a lot over then. As I said before, it was A Clockwork Orange at one point. It's gone through being other things like 2001: A Space Odyssey, The Last Picture Show, A Window, Vertigo. I think I've called all of these my favorite film at some point. But since about 2008, 2009, I had been putting Fanny and Alexander up in the top spot as my favorite film. That's something that I had come to question over the last, say, 4 years. I had come to watch Videodrome from David Cronenberg quite regularly. I was watching it like once every year, once every 2 years. I got to the point where I thought, well, maybe my favorite film actually isn't Fanny Alexander. Maybe it's a Videodrome. So up until last month, I actually had Videodrome as my number one. And then last month, I rewatched Fanny Alexander. And I went, whoa, okay, I'm actually not sure. Maybe I do prefer Fanny Alexander. So Fanny Alexander is a really interesting film because it's from a child's point of view. It's about a boy called Alexander, and his dad passes away. He was an actor, and it was in a film production of Hamlet. He's watching the scene where Hamlet's father, his ghost, speaks to Hamlet and tells him that he has to avenge his death. And then Alexander's own father dies. His father is replaced by the bishop. He seems like a really cruel guy. He doesn't seem to know how to manage children well. Alexander hates him. Sister Fanny hates him. The whole time through, you're never quite sure what's exactly going on. And I think I'm up to 5 viewings of Fanny and Alexander now. And it's got to the point where I don't think the bishop is quite as evil as we perceive him to be at first. which is one of the reasons why I really like the film, because it doesn't have a one-dimensional antagonist. Bishop is never a straightforward evil character. I find him very sympathetic. He really wants a wife. He really wants children. Doesn't know how to handle children. Doesn't know how to treat them. Has no idea, no conception of how to do it. And because of that, Alexander comes to view him as evil. And the whole film is about Alexander asserting himself and growing up and being his own person. And I really like the title of the film, Fanny and Alexander, because the film starts off as him being always grouped together with him and his sister. The parents they call out Fanny Alexander. As the film progresses, he slowly becomes Alexander as he asserts himself. He says things like he does not wish the bishop a good night and talks back to him, and in his own way tries to become his own man. And I'm not going to spoil it too much, but there's some interesting personal identity things that come up later on. And it's just an incredibly dynamic film. So at this stage, I'm not sure. It could be that. It could also be Videodrome, because Videodrome I've watched, as I've said, once every year or every couple of years for the last few years, and it just overwhelms me a lot every time. Like a Clockwork Orange, it's a real audio-visual assault on the senses. Todd Shaw's music score constantly brooding in the background. The ideas of the film that I like the most. Cronenberg just seems really ahead of himself with the film, and some of the predictions in there about where television will go and our relationship to films and television. And I just really love the image of James Woods sticking his head in the television set, because it's sort of the relationship we have when we're watching a film. We become so immersed in it that we don't actually realize that we're still sitting in a living room or on a treadmill or sitting at a table eating dinner while watching, or whatever the case may be. We're actually so immersed in the film's universe. And there's some interesting dialogue. I can't quote it verbatim, but it's things like images about the retina of the mind's eye. It emerges as a real experience. It's all about the experience of watching films. And then you see there's different places like the place which is like a homeless shelter, but it's not a homeless shelter. It has television sets for people who are homeless but who are addicted to watching TV, so they can still get their fix of it. There's the whole idea of a pirate video broadcast that James Woods tapped into, and the video broadcast causes him to have delusions. It causes him to hallucinate. And without spoiling it too much, one of the dynamics that comes out is, why on earth would you watch something like the thing in the pirate broadcast? The pirate broadcast is really ultra extreme violence, torture, sadism, no purpose in there, just for serial thrills. It's sort of like, why would you watch that in the first place? Just the whole idea of the different things that it puts into his mind by watching it taps into a lot of things throughout Cronenberg's filmography. The ideas of creative cancers that have come up in films as early as Crimes of the Future, and the way that our body is changing in relationship to technology and what we're doing. And Cronenberg would do his remake, much superior remake of The Fly, only 3 years after Videodrome, which was a lot about how our bodies are changing based on technology there, accidentally, but still in Videodrome, you've got that sort of edge there and how things are changing. And what was really interesting, I know Clem isn't here with us today, but when I was speaking with Clem before, he said that's really strange that your favorite two films are Videodrome and Fanny Alexander, because they're so different. And they are a bit different stylistically, but I think thematically they're very similar. And it's what I really like, this whole idea of people who can't trust their perceptions. Can't trust with Alexander whether he's really seeing his father's ghost, whether there really is a for him to avenge his father's death. James Wood, you can't tell if he's hallucinating, if it's real. And some of my other favorite films, like Solaris by Andrei Tarkovsky, again, the main protagonist there, he's not sure about whether or not seeing his wife. And films like Eyes Wide Shut, which is also my top 5, where Tom Cruise is not sure exactly what he witnessed that night. So, one way of saying it, still not sure 100% what my favorite film is. I really like those films that really challenge what the perceptions are and whether what we are seeing is real.
It's an interesting 2 picks from Sol there, and they are both films that I really enjoy. David Cronenberg is one of my favourite directors. I discovered him quite early on in my film watching experiences, and I went through his entire filmography. He's obviously renowned for his body horror, and I think the practical effects that he employs in his films are excellent, both in Videodrome and also, as Sol mentioned, in The Fly. They really bring his bizarre creations to life in a way that captivates the audience and displays the horrors that he imagines. With Fanny and Alexander, I really enjoyed that film because for the most part it's kind of played out like a regular drama, but there's a couple of surprising scenes in it. A certain scene in the loft where there's an unexpected moment of kind of horror that hints at something fantastical behind the story. And I really like when films are played predominantly as a straightforward drama, but then they have these little notions that come to the fore in certain scenes that take you by surprise and kind of open the film up to other interpretations separate to the main storyline.
Saul, I have to ask, which version of Fanny and Alexander do you prefer? Theatrical or miniseries?
I've actually only ever seen the miniseries version. I've thought about it over time. Should I watch the 3-hour version and the 5-hour and then compare and contrast? I just look at Fanny Alexander, that it's a perfect film as it is at 5 hours long. Like they say in Amadeus, which notes would you cut out? I don't know which notes I'd cut out of Fanny Alexander, so it's never really seemed any point in me watching the shorter version, but I am sort of morbidly curious about it.
They are very different. The 3-hour film's fine as a standalone, but I also prefer the miniseries version. They could have probably cut out some of the longer speeches from the miniseries, but you lose a lot also, I think, in the shorter version.
I'll just say on that note, with some of the speeches, Fanny Alexander, it does take a long time to warm up because you have lots of scenes of the characters talking. That really annoyed me the first couple of times that I saw it. I mean, I still gave it, a 5 out of 5 or whatever, but I never really, until maybe my third viewing, really got the fact that it was really such a great film because you had that first hour with the Christmas party and all the different characters there. With subsequent viewings, I've come to realize that it's all about presenting this world where Alexander's only a small part of it, and it's only as the film progresses along that he gradually becomes the protagonist in his own story, just like a child, like maturing into adulthood.
And I suppose now it's my turn, and I'm a little bit embarrassed here because the film I've been holding up as my favorite for so many years, Stalker, just didn't live up to my expectations, my vision of it when I saw it again 2 days ago. Maybe it was just the pressure I placed on it as being my number one that led to its demise. I mean, it's still a fantastic and wonderful film, but I just couldn't call it my number one anymore, which is why today I will be talking about Last Year at Marienbad. However, as Stalker has been my favorite film for so long, I feel that I need to present just why I loved it. And I do hope that everyone, including Saul, have actually seen this one, but just in case, I'll just throw in a quick plot summary. Stalker is set in this world, this gray, dark, dead world, where there is this one seeming ray of light. There's a mystical zone, often believed to be magical, which is guarded by the police. And in this zone, it is claimed that there is a room that makes your dreams come true. And to get there, you need to be led by a stalker. A stalker is essentially a guide. And a writer and a scientist join him to reach this room, but with very, very different aims. I think there's 3 components here that really made Stalker earn my love. The first is purely technical, though it affects everything else as well. I mean, it's just the masterly way Tarkovsky shoots all of his films. The long takes, the breathtaking visuals, the tension, the focus, the dark beauty he brings to the screen. The second was just this concept of the zone. I love films that bring this internal logic, where you kind of have to try to figure out how this one thing works. And there's just so much ambiguity, so many rules, so many questions, and I love that in films. And the third is the philosophical dynamics of and between the characters. And these 3 components just makes this incredible whole. A whole which I at one point would have described as one of the tensest and most absorbing experiences that exist. I mean, if you take the absorbing, slow manner in which these characters takes themselves through the complete unknown magical terrain in front of them. And you add in this idea that anything could happen, this feeling that danger is everywhere, that any wrong move is fatal, and you just have them walk through this beautiful landscape, this dystopian, beautiful landscape with tanks and corpses buried in overgrown fields. And this just means that every action these characters make is elevated and questioned. And when I say question, I mean within the film's logic and in a broader philosophical discussion. This also makes it a really great counterpoint to Last Year at Marienbad, which in some ways is really lacking in that latter department. So just quickly, what changed for me this time? Well, I have to say that it just wasn't as absorbed, and this might have been my mood. I mean, honestly, I started to get a bit of a bad feeling as soon as the opening credits started rolling because it felt smaller than I remembered. And I started to nitpick all of these little things, like, that attempt at humor in the beginning, when the writer flirts with this woman and she drives off with his hat. Just these really, really tiny things just decreased my appreciation of it. Give one other example, one of the most suspenseful scenes close to the beginning when they actually try to sneak past the barricades to enter the zone, but there's just this one cop on a bike that's consistently missing them, that just didn't have the edge that it had the first time. I mean, the magic beauty is still here, and as soon as they get to the zone, the film is absolutely fantastic, but I guess the damage at that point was done. And that finally, I'm sorry for taking so long, brings me to its replacement, Last Year at Marienbad, which throughout the years has been a frequent number 2 for me whenever I've set up any lists. Like Stalker, it has an internal, near magical logic where everything seems possible. And both films can and have been interpreted in so many different ways. However, this is where the similarities end. Stalker is actually a relatively straightforward narrative, and its interpretations are based on what we see. In Last Year at Marienbad, we do not know what we see. The entire film is constructed by contradictions. And again, I really hope that everyone, including Saul, has seen this. But just to give a quick summary, a man and a woman at a luxurious hotel. It seems quite mundane. They meet, and he claims that they met before, perhaps at Frederiksbad, perhaps at Marienbad. And she denies it. She claims she doesn't remember it. Every story he tells gets contradicted. She tells him he's wrong. She tells him it didn't happen. And the story just grows and grows from there. And again, there's just so many contradictions. What the characters tell us do not match what we see on the screen. We do not know what's a lie, what's true, what's the present, what's past, what is imagination, or even in just what order these events unfold. This is what makes it so incredibly easy for me to love this film, and I just think that every viewing reveals something new, something that contradicts something you thought before. This one little detail, this one little line that might clear up something or bring something else into the film. But this was also why I hesitated a little bit to make it my top favorite, because if you look at Stalker, like that's a film that has so much philosophy that can be brought into the real world, be that the religious or spirituality debate, be that the critique of the USSR, be that just a peer into the mind of the artist, meaning Tarkovsky. I mean, Marienbad doesn't really have that dimension in the same way, at least to me. But at the same time, Stalker doesn't have what Marienbad has, just this revolutionary story structure and cinematic language crafted in truth, not just by Alain Resnais, but also Alain Robert-Goulet, who was behind the script. And I think few films actively challenges your mind in the same way. And it's just a free-flowing way that Marienbad does it as well. It can place you in this dreamlike state of wonder, or in the mind of a structural puzzle, if you will, where you carefully calculate each answer and how these answers fit together. And I suppose this is where it kind of gets closer to Stalker in just its internal dream logic. There's just so much we can talk about there, simply in terms of iconic cinematography and the way it works with its actors, almost presenting them as statues in a way. just this phenomenal game, the game of Nim, which I discovered because of this film. It's a mathematical game. The characters play it consistently. It always has the same winner. I think it just gives credence to how mathematical and methodical the film is, but at the same time it's anything but, because unlike mathematics, there's no direct truth, there's no direct answers, and having a film I can engage with in this way, it's just a dream to me. But yeah, like I said, when I choose my favorite film, it's really difficult, and there's so many competitors. I mean, one of the top ones would probably be Le Bonheur by Agnes Varda, because there you have both internal stylistic logic, and it does so many incredible things, but at the same time it has a broader, terrifying point about humanity. And that separates it a lot from many of my other favorite films, like Children of Paradise, which is just absolutely gorgeous, or films like Heroic Purgatory and Eden and After by Alain Robert-Quillette, that are a lot more similar to Last Year at Marienbad, if you will, in that it has this internal logic in place around with time and structure. And then, of course, it's my favorite director, Jean-Luc Godard, and so many of his films could end up becoming my all-time favorite. So I think, like, if anything, this podcast has proved to me that I really just need to sit down and rewatch my favorite films over and over again until I actually work this out. But Last Year at Marienbad is just a fantastic choice, at least in my mind, and I love that film so much.
So it's an interesting choice of favourite films there, Chris. I have to say that both of these films are the kind that I appreciate more than enjoy. So I respect the artistic direction that's taken in them and how beautifully the films are presented, but neither of them resonate with me on a personal level that I would need to have for them to be considered favourites. Now, it's interesting that you mentioned Stalker, because I recently reread the novel that it's based upon, Roadside Picnic by the Strugatsky brothers. And Stalker, the film, goes on quite a different path that the novel takes. The philosophical slant of Stalker seems to be Tarkovsky's own ideas on the concept, whereas the book, there's a lot more action, there's a lot of events that are taking place, and it actually follows the lives of some stalkers over a series of years. There's 4 separate chapters which revisits them during various points in their lives. And I also think it's interesting that the novel is called Roadside Picnic, because the authors imagined that the zone that we see in Stalker could basically be an area where aliens or extraterrestrial life have just stopped by briefly in passing. They're like humans who've had a picnic in a forest and left all their empty wrappers and rubbish, and the animals in the forest don't understand what any of these objects that are left behind are. And that was the main concept for Stalker, that humans were seeing all these discarded items and objects that have distorted the landscape that we are used to and created something strange that we wanted to find out more about.
Yes, I have seen Stalker, and I have seen Last Year at Marienbad. I know I've got a few gaps in my film viewing career, but I've been into film for about 19 years. I have got around to these films at various points. I do really like Stalker. I've seen that one a couple of times, and it's got a really great basic story into it about these characters going into the zone for different reasons, and the sort of idea that I've seen in a lot of other films since then, like recently Alex Garland's Annihilation had the same sort of idea of these characters wandering into an unknown place. Even the Leonardo DiCaprio film by Danny Boyle called The Beach reminded me a little bit of Stalker. So a lot of films that I see remind me a lot of Stalker. I just want to get that vibe from, and just that whole idea about venturing into the unknown, which is very similar to Solaris, and probably something which I really like about Solaris also. And yeah, Last Year at Marienbad, that's again been a very highly influential film to me. It's another film that when I watch a lot of films, I often pick up that Marienbad connection, the whole idea of a mysterious place with different people doing different things, contradictory dialogue, like Chris said, and the whole uncertainty of what's going on. Last Year at Marienbad, or was it Frederiksbad? And it's just very stylistically a very interesting film. I love the photography by Sacha Vioni, going up and down all the different corridors. Vioni also did a lot of Peter Greenaway films like The Cook, The Thief, His Wife and Her Lover. It's a very lusciously shot, very involving universe, and a film that's definitely made an impact on me, even though you don't quite understand everything at the end of it. And when push comes to shove, I probably prefer Hiroshima Mon Amour of the Rene films that I've seen. Last year at Marienbad's definitely a very impressive film, and a film that I've enjoyed seeing a couple of times over the years, maybe 3 times even. And it's another one in my Blu-ray collection that I actually have seen.
And I think that brings us to a conclusion, guys. Thank you so much for joining once again.
I've really enjoyed discussing not only my favourite film, but everyone else's favourite film today. And if anyone listening would like to share their stories of their favourite films with us, we'd love to hear from you. We have a dedicated podcast thread on the ICM forum, which can be found on icmforum.com. So please feel free to come and share your stories with us.
So one thing I would say is don't be like me. Actually go out and watch some of these films, because a lot of films that I got into really early on when I was getting into my film-going journey, which I just haven't got around to over the years as other things have taken priorities. I guess it's don't want to be in the point where you've been watching films for 19 years and you're able to say, well, I still haven't seen Seven Samurai. I would try and see some of these iconic films that actually are really good, or at least the ones that I've seen, been pretty good.
And on that note, join us again next time when we'll actually talk about some of the biggest films we have been avoiding and why. Talking Images is brought to you by icmforum.com, one of the best places to discuss films and find new recommendations. Join today. Thank you for listening and join us again soon.